Tonight on The Body Politic, finding a site for a new international airport. Where will it be and who will object? San Diego voters decide in November 2006. That's next on UCSD TV. Hello, I'm Michael Bernstein, a professor of history and economics here at UCSD. San Diego's Lindbergh Field Airport has long been recognized as too small for a region of this size. It was built in 1928, and though the terminals have been upgraded from time to time, the airport still has just one runway, causing bottlenecks and headaches for many travelers. Various efforts to build a new airport have failed over the years. So in 2003, responsibility for airport planning was turned over to the newly created San Diego County Regional Airport Authority. The president and chief executive officer of the Airport Authority is Thella Bowens, and she is with us tonight. Welcome, Thella.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Let's start with need. Explain why we need a new airport in San Diego.
Well, what we really need is airport capacity that will service the more than 28 million annual passengers that will pass through San Diego International by the year 2030. We actually did a forecast demand study last year, and that study shows that by 2015, this airport, as it is currently configured, will reach its absolute capacity with over 23 million annual passengers. At the same time, it will, around 2023, the number of operations that we can operate out of that airport will reach its capacity of a one-runway airport, and that's about 300,000 annual operations. The demand numbers actually show that out through the year 2030, the demand for air service will more than double from today's numbers.
It's fascinating you mentioned the one runway configuration at Lindbergh. I noticed that comparable airports with a one runway configuration are in Juneau, Alaska, Bangor, Maine, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and these are cities that are much smaller than the San Diego region and are not growing as rapidly as this region.
That's absolutely true. We're more comparable to a city like Tampa, Florida. In fact, our demographics are very similar to Tampa and Portland, Oregon. And if you look at both of those airports, they have multiple runway systems, and they have a lot of land area to be able to grow their terminals as well as their airfields. And that's the kind of access that San Diego really needs if the city is going to be a player in the global market, which we continue to say that we are and that we want to be in the future.
Well, how do you go about selecting or evaluating potential new sites?
Well, we've been in this process since the year 2001, actually. We actually started looking at new sites before the airport transitioned over from the port to the new airport authority. We actually worked with SANDAG to set up the original studies and working with funds from the FAA. We had on our list originally some 32 sites. We've whittled that down. I won't go through the entire process that we went through to do that, but using various criteria, we have whittled that list down to 9 sites. We are going through some analysis now, a lot of technical analysis that will evaluate the potential of the sites to work from an operational, technical, environmental, financial perspective, and those are some of the things that we will evaluate over the next several
Just to ask you about some of the technical issues. The one runway that currently operates at Lindbergh, this runway is not long enough to allow for takeoff of the large jumbo jets that would travel internationally. Is that part of the problem?
Part of the problem is the length of the runway, but it's only a small portion of the problem. The real problem is the terrain that surrounds Lindbergh Field. Lindbergh actually sits at the bottom of a bowl with rising terrain at both ends of the runway, and it is that terrain that really limits the kinds of operations that you can have out of Lindbergh Field. It actually requires that aircraft of a certain size take a penalty in either passengers, fuel, cargo in order to depart from Lindbergh Field. And that, for the airlines, those pounds that they lose really mean dollars in their pockets, and they can't afford to do that.
In evaluating both Lindbergh itself for possible expansion or other sites, one of the key concerns then is not simply runway length, but the surrounding area, the surrounding terrain.
Absolutely.
Well, could you tell us which sites you were closely considering in those 9?
Well, right now we are looking at the 4 sites on our list that are non-military related. That includes Campo, Borrega Springs, a desert site out in Imperial County, and Lindbergh Field. Lindbergh Field is required by state law, under the state law that created the airport authority, to remain on the list as a viable site for us to study.
Let me just ask you about, you mentioned there are 5 military sites that at the moment are not being actively considered by the authority. Now, this has something to do with the BRAC deliberations, the base realignment and closure efforts in Washington. But perhaps we could talk a bit about why these military bases are not being actively considered, and perhaps I can also ask you, has the issue of joint use been taken up, or will it be taken up by your group?
Well, we're not studying the military sites right now because both our Washington delegation and our Sacramento delegations asked us to delay studying any of the military sites until the BRAC was actually settled, which will occur at the end of calendar year 05. And our board, in being a good citizen in San Diego, decided that that was the appropriate thing to do. And so we are not studying any of those bases until after the BRAC is totally signed off on at the end of the year. Joint use is an issue that has cropped up periodically. It requires some study of military bases in order to consider that, and in regard to the agreement that we made not to study them, we really are not looking at joint use at this point. Our board has not met to discuss joint use, and that probably won't
And to
occur.
be clear for our viewers, joint use meaning a joint military and civilian facility that would have operations for both the military and commercial and general aviation.
Yes.
A little history here. In June of 1994, there had been a proposition passed in San Diego. It wasn't an overwhelming margin. It was something like 52 to 47%, but a proposition, so-called Proposition A, did pass, where the voters said that if the Miramar Naval Air Station was on the BRAC list back then for closure as a military facility, then that should be the site for a new international airport in the region. This then provoked a member of the congressional delegation, Duke Cunningham, to insist that he would never see Miramar close, and he attached a rider in the 1996 Defense Authorization Act that committed the Secretary of the Navy never to allow joint use at Miramar. But now we're in another round of BRAC. So if I'm understanding you correctly, if BRAC does look closely again at Miramar, your group would then reassess that site as it would any other military site on the BRAC list at the end of 2005?
I'm not sure of exactly what happens in the BRAC at this point. It's my understanding that those sites that are on the list are the ones that have been recommended for closure or realignment, and nothing in San Diego County has been recommended for closure or realignment.
And so, okay, and so that would mean that essentially then these sites would be off the table.
They certainly are off the table as a closed base for us to look at. And as for the issue of joint use, our board has not taken any new position on joint use, except for the fact that we won't even discuss the issue until the BRAC situation is totally resolved. Yes.
Again, for the record, there are joint use facilities elsewhere in the United States.
Yes, there are. I think there are, if I'm not mistaken, there are 11 joint use situations in the U.S.
And these are successful international airports? To the best of your knowledge?
To the best of my knowledge, the only one that pops in my mind immediately that I know of is Honolulu. But they seem to be operating well.
Okay. Let's talk about some of the other sites that you are actively analyzing now, since they're not part of the BRAC process, to the east of the major urban area of San Diego, Borrego Springs, Campo, both in San Diego County, and then the Imperial Valley, the so-called desert site, which is actually in Imperial County. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the major issues you're grappling with those three sites?
Well, of course, all three of those sites have one issue, and that's distance, where how far they are from the central area of population or employment in San Diego County. And the central area of population and employment occurs somewhere around the intersection of Interstates 15 and Highway 52. And in order to get easy accessibility or timely accessibility to those sites, we actually have to look at some kind of a rapid conveyance system or other means of access to the system, to those three sites, to make them work, because each one of them is some distance beyond that population employment center, and frankly a distance beyond any where any airport in the United States today is located from its central city district.
Oh, so I mean, one analogy I have heard bandied about, looking at, say, the Campo or Borrego Springs sites. The desert site is farther to the east, but Campo and Borrego Springs, one analogy I've heard people draw is to the Dulles International Airport in the D.C. area, but that's not as far.
Well, no, it's not as far. If I'm not mistaken, Dulles is somewhere between 25 and 30 miles from the D.C. area. Campo is over 60 miles.
More than double. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
And Borrego Springs is more than 80, and then the desert site is more than 100 miles.
So this would really be absolutely new terrain.
Yes,
if we were to go that route.
Yes, it is, but part of what we're charged with is looking at this problem and this issue from a new perspective, not just operating within today's paradigms, but actually looking out 15 to 20 years from now. What will San Diego County look like 15 to 20 years from now, and what will be how will the airport need to operate 15 to 20 years from now? And so those are important considerations as we look at all of the sites, but particularly those three sites.
Right. I know that Bob Filner, the Democratic member of the San Diego congressional delegation, is quite excited about this Imperial Valley site, and he's been talking up these new technologies for high-speed rail transit, a so-called maglev, magnetic levitation train that could move a couple of hundred miles an hour, I guess. So you'll be assessing the transportation alternatives as well as you look at these sites, or are you focused solely on the aviation issues in your mandate?
Transportation is absolutely critical to the aviation issue. One thing that we found, first of all, in dealing with and learning from the community about what they wanted, every community group that we've talked to, every focus group, every dialogue group has indicated that they want mass transit that gets people to and from the airport. So that's the number one consideration. The other consideration is how can you get the best accessibility for the most people to the sites. And so in this next round of analysis, we will be looking at various kinds of rapid conveyance to get people to and from each one of these sites.
Let me ask you about Lindbergh Field, which is the other site now obviously established and in operation that you're looking at. There are some maps of potential new configurations in the Lindbergh area, how to go to a multiple runway. Are these matters that you're actively considering, or does your group feel that they're really not realistic, given the desire to have a facility achieve the things you mentioned as we opened our conversation, without surrounding terrain that interferes with the departure of heavily loaded large aircraft?
Well, we are looking at various configurations at the existing airport. We're limited in that we can't look at the land that's owned by the military, which is right adjacent.
The Marine Corps recruiting depot. Right.
Absolutely, to the airport. And so that limits the kinds of things that can occur on that site. But I should mention that even if we were able to, even if we owned the land that now belongs to MCRD, the original work that the port did starting back in 1997 on Lindbergh Field actually showed that you couldn't put enough of a runway system in there to meet the total demand out through the year 2030. So no matter what you do at Lindbergh itself, it continues to be a constrained site. The way we're looking at Lindbergh as a part of the total solution actually have been to look at Lindbergh in conjunction with other facilities to see if it could be tied to other facilities in some way to make it meet the total air transportation demand numbers.
I know this had come up in 1994 in discussion around the Proposition A that I had mentioned, that Lindbergh would be a kind of local airport serving domestic routes, and that then there would be a new facility or other facility that would provide the international aviation services we were talking about.
Well, and we have looked and continue to look at not only just international aviation services, but all kinds of aviation services. How can we look at this from a regional perspective using the facilities that we have on our list to create a regional system of some kind? So those are the kinds of, it might not just be international, it could be just regional service versus intercontinental service, or it could be cargo service. It could be a lot of different kinds of things. But what we are charged with is coming up with a solution. It doesn't necessarily have to be one site, but a solution to this problem, and that's the road down which we're proceeding.
You mentioned cargo. This raises a question about a site or a proposal that at the moment is not evidently on your list. Brown Field, which is a general aviation field in the southern part of San Diego, right on the border. There have been proposals in the past to convert that into at least an international cargo aviation facility. Years ago, during the 1994 ballot debate, some discussion of a twin ports proposal with Rodriguez International Airport on the Mexican side of the border in Tijuana. But this apparently is now off the table, or it's not actively under analysis by your group?
Well, both of those sites actually fell off the list early on for different reasons. Even though we have looked at the possibility of creating a cargo airport and having it supplement the service, one thing that we found with that is that there is not enough cargo operations to really reduce the demand. So if you removed all cargo from Lindbergh Field, you don't reduce the demand substantially. You still have the problem because you're only talking about a total of 15 flights a day or something like that. So when you're talking about 600 flights a day, that is not a lot of capacity that you're adding to yourself if you removed all cargo. We looked at Brown Field, and it had several issues surrounding it, terrain being one of those. And so you don't want to move from one terrain issue to another terrain issue. You also have the issue of being so close to Mexican airspace down there, which creates its own set of dynamics. In terms of the cross-border, I guess it was the Tijuana connection.
Twin Ports idea.
Twin Ports connection. We actually removed that I think October of 2003 from the list. One of our board members was pretty passionate in his concern that we were trying to plan an airport in a foreign country, and how would we feel about the Mexican government planning an airport over here when they weren't at the table. And he convinced the other board members that it was appropriate to take it off, and it was taken off at that time. There are also some security issues that we have to consider, and I have talked to TSA about the security issues of having an airport with cross-border connections.
The Transportation Safety Administration.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I'm so used to using these acronyms.
All the acronyms.
Yes, but with 9/11, security at the airport has become the centerpiece of everything that we do. And quite frankly, it would take layers and layers and layers of security in order to make that happen. So it's something that is not on our list today.
And let me ask you a question again about a site that I know you're not examining right now, but it does seem to have been a political football in the past, as I mentioned, and that's Miramar. I mean, the Navy came into Miramar decades and decades ago, presumably because they found it a suitable site for aviation operations. The elite fighter weapons school was there for years and years, so-called Top Gun. They moved that to Naval Air Station Fallon some years ago. The Marine Corps is now at Miramar. Now, independent of Representative Cunningham's profound opposition to a joint use idea, from an aviation perspective, isn't that one of the best sites we have in the area, given its terrain, the length of its runways, and transportation infrastructure already in place?
Well, I'll just tell you what the FAA told me when I asked them this very question. And their position was, we can't tell you if that's a good site until we study airspace with joint use, because the airspace becomes one of the key factors there. And we've never looked at the airspace issues of trying to operate a civilian operation and a military operation in that space up there. And so we can't answer the questions about whether or not it would work, because we've never had the opportunity to do those studies.
Well, I would assume there's also an added political wrinkle here. So we have this political issue involving the military, and obviously Representative Cunningham has gone on the record and had this rider attached to the 1996 Defense Authorization Act. But one would also speculate there's a political problem involving aircraft operating over La Jolla and Del Mar, because those are the communities that are directly to the west of this facility. I mean, people who work in La Jolla and Del Mar know that fighter jets are taking off over this area because they're fairly noisy aircraft. So isn't it safe to assume that there's some very powerful political opposition to expanding this facility for civilian use, even if it were possible?
There's political opposition to expanding an airport anywhere you put it. So that's not exclusive to La Jolla and Del Mar. I think that there's no, everybody understands that NIMBYism exists when it comes to siting an airport. And so that's going to be a problem. I don't care which of the sites on the list you choose to either put a new airport or expand service at a current airport. Even expanding service in areas where there's already airport operations tends to be a problem, because people are concerned about the noise issues and safety factors and those kinds of things.
And there's even opposition, as I understand it, to the east in these East County and desert sites from some people who would rather not see any development in these areas.
Absolutely, absolutely. So every single site has its detractors.
What about one other idea that I know was floated out there in '94 is an ocean airport, a floating airport off the coast. Is this just pie in the sky, not a realistic thing to be considered?
Well, that idea has been brought to us a couple of times. The technology surrounding that doesn't seem to support a large airport facility like we would need for a commercial airport. We have talked to the military some about some work that they have done on the floating airport scenario. But at this point, it just doesn't appear to be a technology that works.
The military investigations are of smaller facilities,
yes,
presumably. Assuming that all of these complications can be resolved ultimately, and a new site or a decision is made about expansion of capacity, who pays for the expansion of capacity, the development of new facilities? How does that work?
Well, the good news is that the development of the airport itself is paid for by airport fees, airport user fees. We are an enterprise, and we generate certain funds on the airport, and we use those to pay for all capital improvement, including a new airport. We have some money that we get from what's called the Airport Improvement Program, which is the ticket tax that's
The
on
tax on the
everyone's
tickets, yeah.
ticket. We have airport revenues that we generate from businesses that we run at the airport, the concessions, the parking, the ground transportation services, all those kinds of things. We will let airport revenue bonds that are backed by the credit of the airport authority and supported by agreements that we will have in place with the airlines. A large amount of our revenue comes from airlines, the landing fees and the terminal rents that they pay, and in agreements that we negotiate with them, they help us to pay for the airport itself. There are some ancillary services such as highways and some of the rapid transportation that goes to the airport that the airport cannot pay for under federal regulations as they are today. And those do come from the state and from the local governments that surround
those responsible for the
airport.
transportation
Yes.
infrastructure.
Yes, but even some dedicated rapid transit can be paid for by the airport, but it has to be dedicated exclusively for the airport before the airport
Not
would
simply be part of
eligible.
a municipal transit system,
Absolutely.
say.
Yes, that's true.
So your plan then, over the next year and a half, is to narrow down options and evaluate and sift and consider and come up with one site, a specific proposal that would then appear on the ballot in November of 2006 for an up and down decision, correct, by the voters.
Well, it's not clear right now what's going to be on the ballot because the language that says that it must go to the public for a vote doesn't specify what must be on the ballot. So our board has not yet determined how they will structure the ballot issue itself. And I'm sure how that will be structured will depend a great deal on how far we are along in this process and what kinds of answers we've been able to come up with.
And what happens if the vote, whatever you decide to put on the ballot, and I assume the ballot would either be for San Diego County or San Diego County and Imperial County, depending on the decisions you make. What happens if the voters say no?
If the voters say no, then we have a lot. I think San Diego has a lot of choices to make about what they want to be in the future, because Lindbergh Field, as it is today and as it is with the land area that it has today, is extraordinarily constrained. And when people make a decision in November of '06, they are not just making a decision about the airport. They are making long-term decisions about how they want San Diego to develop.
About the city, about the
Absolutely.
county, maybe even two counties if Imperial County
Absolutely,
is involved.
because even though the airport isn't the end-all and begin-all of quality of life in San Diego County, it does contribute, because this airport contributes $4.5 billion a year annually to this region's economy. As it becomes more and more constrained, you're going to find the prices of tickets going up. You're going to find businesses that can't get their product and their employees back and forth to their markets. They're going to begin to make decisions that are going to affect San Diego. And those are the kinds of decisions that will affect the quality of life. And it will all hinge upon the decision that people make at the polls in November of '06.
In the fall of 2006. Well, you've got quite a job cut out for you over the next 16 months. We wish you the best. My guest has been Thella Bowens, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the San Diego County Regional Airport Authority. She is overseeing the effort to find a location for a new airport facility that voters will support in a November 2006 election. Thank you for joining us on The Body Politic. I'm Michael Bernstein. Good night.